They're live in 3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome. My name is Akasemi Newsome, and I'm the Associate Director of the Institute of European Studies here at the University of California, Berkeley. We're very honored to bring you today a lecture titled Germany's New China Policy. Will Berlin revise its previously benign course on Beijing? This will be featuring the expertise of Heribert Dieter, Senior Fellow, German Institute of International and Security Affairs in Berlin, Germany. And it'll be moderated by our own Professor Vinny Agarwal, Distinguished Professor and Alan P. Bedford Chair in Asian Studies, also affiliated with the Department of Political Science and Director of the Berkeley APEC Study Center. Vinny.
Thank you, Akasemi. I look forward to Heribert's presentation. As Akasemi mentioned, Heribert is a senior fellow at the German Institute for International Security Affairs in Berlin. He was also a visiting professor at Zeppelin University, which I've had the opportunity to visit, and that's where the Zeppelins were built, so I was very excited to be there. And he's also a professor at Potsdam University. And I saw him in Hong Kong a couple of years ago when he was a visiting professor at the University of Hong Kong. He has published extensively, and his most important claim to fame is he's my friend, and we've known each other for a very long time. So thank you very much for coming, and welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Akasemi, and thank you very much, Vinny, for your kind words of introduction. It's excellent to be here amongst real people. And of course, we have a very turbulent world out there, many issues to discuss, and I'll try to briefly look at, in particular, the German policy on China. Let me start with a quote by Lenin. Lenin said, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. And one has the impression that we are exactly in such a turbulent moment. We have multiple crises. We have, of course, Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. We have a crisis in monetary affairs. And we have perhaps the beginning of an economic crisis in China. And these are challenging phases for policymakers and also for academics. In particular, the question has to be asked, what are how shall the geopolitical developments be read? What do they mean? And what conclusions do we draw from there? And in particular, from a German perspective, what are the effects of the conflict with China? Of course, for decades, we asked ourselves, how shall we organize, how shall we accompany and manage the rise of China? But we may ask ourselves, and this was a piece in the Wall Street Journal about 3-4 months ago, maybe we'll have to manage the decline of China. Maybe it will be more problematic than we thought for a long time. Now, Germany, of course, is not the most important player in that game. Germany's policies towards China are significant, but we are not the major player. But at the same time, and I live in Germany, and I, of course, am surrounded by part of the policy debate, but Germany continues to be a bit of an enigmatic player. It's difficult to predict what the Germans will be doing. It is difficult when you look at the current situation. It's difficult to predict because the Germans have turned belligerent in this conflict. Former pacifists have become very, very firm in their positions. The British Economist said the Germans are turning plowshares to swords. And of course, this is an interesting development. This week, in the new edition, the German magazine Der Spiegel quipped that the greens should be relabeled as olive greens. So we have a really interesting situation, and we talk a lot about what that means, but we also, of course, then have to ask the question, how trustworthy is Germany as a partner? And there has been a long debate, I don't want to go into the details, that Germany is taking the benefits of international exchange, but is not contributing to making the world a more stable place. More than 150 years ago, we already had the German poet Heinrich Heine talk about the unpredictability of German policy, and I translated a part of his Wintermärchen from 1844. He said, "French and Russians own the land, the sea belongs to the British. But in the airy kingdom of dreams, our rule is undisputed." Now, this is, of course, an interesting observation. Conventionally, German foreign policy is considered to be transparent and predictable. But as I just said, it seems to be much more difficult these days. And what is making foreign policy development difficult for Germany is that successive German governments have believed in the benefits of supranational governance. We believe in global governance. We thought that there is no nation state, and consequently, this is a very difficult situation for many policymakers in Germany. The German Foreign Office published a white paper last year, and I translate the title. It is called "Together for the People." This is a white paper on multilateralism, and it is, of course, the opposite of a defined strategy. It is a lot of wishful thinking, and I think this is important to consider. There is a lack of strategic thinking in Germany, and at the moment, the mood has changed. It's no longer pacifist, it's belligerent, and I'm not sure what frightens me more. The current mood is, for some, and the debate, Habermas has recently commented on it, it's quite unexpected. But I leave it at that. I don't want to talk about Ukraine. I want to talk about China, and 3 points. Germany's China policy under Merkel, the Chinese 5-year plan, and the new German government's policy. So first point, traditional German policy towards China was basically a policy, a Hamiltonian policy, if you want to call it like that. We emphasized trade. We wanted to do business in China. We wanted to invest in China. Many German companies did. At the same time, my observation is that trade with China is often overestimated. 7% of German exports go to China. That's significant. And China is the single largest market for German exports. That is significant. And Germany exports more to China than the next 10 EU economies combined. So it is important. But we do more trade with Poland and Hungary than with China, and these are only 50 million people. And if we add the Czech Republic to the equation, then 280 billion euros worth of trade with those 3 countries in 2019 is about 110 billion euros more than trade with China in the same year. So what is a bit puzzling for us academic observers is that whilst trade with China is important, the perception is that we shall not survive without intensive trade with China. And the question is, why has that happened? Why have successive governments and why has the public always believed that trade, economic exchange with China is so important for the well-being of Germans? I have a witness, a relatively unsuspicious witness, das Institut der deutschen Wirtschaft, a business association institute, and they said, and I translated the quotation, "The perception of China's importance for the German economy is distorted by the high sales and profits of some major German companies." And to put that into plain English, it's the car industry that makes a lot of money in China. And the car industry has been successfully portraying China as the indispensable trading partner of Germany. Just as one short figure, production of German car companies in China in 2019 was 5 million vehicles, and in Germany they produced 4.7 million vehicles. So production in China is indeed more important. But the question is, why has the government believed what the car industry has told them? This is a bit of a puzzle. I would think it is fair to say that players with a disproportionately large business in China have succeeded in presenting the interests of their companies as particularly important for the economic development of Germany. And Chancellor Merkel has embraced that approach. For her years in power, she has never questioned the benefits of doing business in China. I would like to continue with a little anecdote that I observed, and the man in the center is the CEO of Volkswagen, a gentleman called Herbert Diess. And Herbert Diess gave an interview to a German newspaper in February 2021, and he said, only 5.7% of mankind live in democracies as we know it, according to The Economist. We would prefer to do business with democracies only, but since there are so few customers, we have to do business in China. And this was, I read that in the newspaper and I thought, 5.7 sounds a bit low. I mean, I know that democracy is not expanding at the moment, but 5.7% is a bit low. So I looked at that index, which was not produced by The Economist, as Diess claimed, but it was produced by The Economist Intelligence Unit. It's a separate entity. They are related. Anyway, what they count as flawed democracies were not included in those 5.7%. I give you some examples. Countries like Mexico and Singapore are considered to be flawed democracies, but also Belgium, France, Italy, Brazil, and the United States, just to name a few. So if you add those, you end up with 50% of the world's population living in full or flawed democracies. And if you add some other countries, then like Singapore, then of course you end up with a figure of 2/3 of mankind living in democracies. Now, the point that I would like to make is not that a CEO of a very large company tries to portray this problem or to shape this problem. No, nobody questioned it. The newspaper from Braunschweig, which is next to Wolfsburg, where Volkswagen produces, just took the sentence, 5.7% and so on. The Zeit, the left-leaning Taz, the Süddeutsche, nobody questioned its statement. So it might be a bit of a small piece of evidence that Germans want to believe that story. They want to believe that it is important to do business with non-democracies and that you cannot have a critical perception of China. Some social democratic politicians, of course, have also supported the long-standing politically neutral position on China. Sigmar Gabriel and Rudolf Scharping, both former leading social democrats, complained that the idea of putting China under global house arrest is misleading, and they continued to emphasize what has been the key policy for German post-war governments. We believe in change through trade, so we do trade, and we hope that at the end of the day, China will become both a democracy and a market economy, which, of course, this is a dying perspective, but it's still it was the dominating one. Now, back to Merkel and back to her policies on China. She visited China almost every year in her 16 years in power, and rarely a critical word. And to underline her benign perception of China, she pushed this comprehensive agreement on investment in her last months in power, the comprehensive agreement on investment between the European Union and China. It is not implemented because the European Parliament will not support it. partly because some of the European Parliament's members have a travel ban, have been exposed to a travel ban. So this agreement will not be implemented. I continue to ask myself, why has China been so, or why has the perception of China been so benign, in particular in Chancellor Merkel's time, and why has she been so uncritical, where the rest of the world has been critical, whilst German business has become more critical of China? She continued to have a very, neutral is already exaggerated, a very positive view on China. It's difficult for me. I'm not a psychologist, but it didn't make too much sense. And what we observe today, I would suggest since 2018, is that the drivers of a new policy on China are not politicians, but business people. And business people see their prospects diminishing. They fear that it will be difficult to continue doing business in China. And the private sector has changed its policies towards China. The government has followed rather than the other way around. And I think this is a remarkable development. Observers from the private sector continue to ask themselves whether China is on a sustainable trajectory in its economic policies. And I don't want to go into details, but just consider total debt in China rose from 300% of GDP to 340% of GDP in 1 year. So an increase of total debt of 40% of GDP in 1 year. That is, it's Martin Wolf would say, it's not sustainable. It is a policy. It is a development that is worrying. Plus real estate prices and so on and so forth. So just Kenneth Rogoff wrote about Chinese real estate, and he said, per capita, the Chinese have more living space than the Germans. Now, considering that Germany is significantly more affluent, this could mean two things. Germans live in small flats, or there is too much real estate in China. Either of the two, or something in between. But I thought that is quite a remarkable observation that China has more housing per capita, more surface than Germany. Second point, the 5-year plan and what that means for the German economy. China embraces a concept of at least partial self-sufficiency. They want to dissociate themselves in a good old 1970s terminology. They want to dissociate themselves from the world market. And this has been a project Xi Jinping has announced for a number of years. In November 2018, he complained that it was increasingly difficult to source high-tech from abroad. And he said that growing protectionism from other economies would force China to go down the path of self-sufficiency. 2 years later, he announced that in the new 5-year plan, there will be a new economic policy. You, of course, all know the name, dual circulation. That means China should, by strengthening domestic production and demand, become less dependent on foreign countries. And at the same time, General Secretary Xi wants to ensure that China remains indispensable for international production networks. In other words, self-sufficiency is good for us, but not for you. And that is an odd concept, to say it mildly. China is breaking away from other markets, but it continues to supply important components to the rest of the world. I've worked a little bit on that whilst in Hong Kong, and I've looked at Chinese economic history and the history of thought on international trade in China. And of course, this is nothing new. There had been an inward-looking economic thinking in China for hundreds of years. The emperors were, of course, not outward-looking. They were forced by the British in the Opium Wars to partially open their economy, but they were not eager to do that. They were told to do it. They were forced to do it. And Mao, of course, was not eager to integrate the Chinese economy into the global economy. Basically, Deng Xiaoping was the exception rather than the rule. Deng's twin reforms of permitting private enterprise and opening China for international trade was the exception. Now we go back to previous economic thinking, and that is, of course, not a good development. If you are a German manager and if you own a company and you want to do business there, you realize very quickly that this is a threat to your business model. And just as a small remark, the debate on whether we OECD countries should reduce our trade and investment with and in China is sometimes a bit odd, because those decisions are made for us in Beijing. We don't have to decide. It is already decided, at least in part. I come to the new government, and the key question here is whether and how long, if so, how long should Germany and Europe hold on to the perspective that China will sooner or later become a market economy and a democracy? I think it is fair to say that there will be a new approach, and already is a new approach with the new government. Of course, Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock has other things on our agenda at the moment, but she has been quite explicit in her statements that there will not be a policy on China like in the past. There will be a firmer policy of Germany on China, and put differently, Germany will cease to be the exception in Europe when it comes to China policies. That was the case for a number of years. The British have been more critical of China for a number of years. Emmanuel Macron was in Beijing in 2019, and he was very critical of China. So basically, Germany catches up, if you want to use that term, with the other Europeans and ceases to be an exception. At the same time, this is not an easy process. In German society, there continues to be quite a bit of sympathy for China. There continues to be sympathy for a country that has permitted its population to have a significant increase of its living standards, and so on and so forth. And there is also a bit of a reluctance to be uncritical of the United States of America. You could argue that Germans and other Europeans are still recovering from the Trump years. That is one way of putting it. But the German society has always had a very polarized perception of US presidents. They were the greatest admirers of Barack Obama, were found in Berlin. When he gave a talk in Berlin, people were almost as frantic as they were when Kennedy was there. And they were the fiercest critics, the Germans, of Trump. And of course, this has not completely ended with Biden. When we look at the Indo-Pacific region, Germany still tries to develop a policy. We have some guidelines, but permit me being quite cynical about those guidelines. The executive summary is 12 pages long. The entire document is 65 pages. It covers everything from building a port in Tonga to I don't know what, but it's not a strategy. And we don't name priorities, and that is a problem. Everything is listed. There are no priorities. The question is, could Germany join the Quad in 5 years? As there has been discussion that France and Britain could potentially join the Quad, in order to make it clear that there is resistance against China's policies. Given the current speed of change, it sounds possible, but coming back to what I said earlier, I'm not entirely sure, but given the current belligerent nature of the discourse in Germany, whether I find that completely convincing, but it is appropriate to say that the awareness that there are risks out there beyond climate change, that has grown. And both policymakers and the public are discussing intensely what to do with that. And of course, I have to repeat that German companies are revising their China strategy. So let me conclude. China continues to be an interesting case, a fascinating but difficult partner. There has been a turnaround in economic policy. The Communist Party is focusing on isolation and not on exchange. It's their choice, but we will have to live with that. And numerous other countries, from Australia to Japan, have already taken a position on China, which is different from the German position. I find it noteworthy that Chancellor Scholz has just been to Japan, not to China, last week. So one of his first, actually I think it was his first trip to Asia, has been to Japan. I think that sends a signal. And if we would do that, if we would kind of implement what the Chinese government has been suggesting we should do, reduce the intensity of economic exchange, it would be less costly than conventionally assumed. The Institute for the World Economy in Kiel has calculated what it would cost us, and it's 1% of GDP, if there were no trade with China. So that is, I would say, manageable, and we are talking about cutting economic ties with other countries at the moment, and we are seeing the cost of that development. But I'm pretty sure that the new government will, once we will have a solution, and this is wishful thinking, I'm aware of that, in Ukraine, then the next issue on the foreign policy agenda of the German government will be China, together with other European countries, and of course together with the United States. So thanks for your attention, and I look forward to discussing.
So yes, go ahead.
My name is Roman. Quick question. I mean, I totally agree with the argument that the German car lobby or automobile lobby is a very strong. The German automakers have a very strong lobby in such a politics. You may argue a self-harming lobby in the sense that they were reluctant to change to e-mobility, and now facing the world market, especially Tesla and other companies, they turn around quite late. So, but there's another thing which I would like to get your opinion on that. Like German car makers were the first in China. Actually, if I remember correctly, in the 70s, China reached out to Toyota and they were reluctant to invest, and now it was a Volkswagen. Do you see this as also as a problem, as part of the reason why this long economic kind of cooperation on a very close basis, just as a point why it's so hard? I mean, like,
Director?
Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, this is absolutely true. The German car industry, Volkswagen in particular, under Karl Hahn, went into China in, I think, 1980. And mind you, China was producing a mere 220,000 vehicles in that year. And the production increased 110-fold to 24 million in 2017. And Germany was, the German car industry was part of that explosion of production. Of course, you like that if you are part of such a dynamic development, and billions of money were made. It is difficult to get something out of Volkswagen when it comes to the share of money, profits they make in China rather than the profits they make elsewhere. At the same time, and it's absolutely true what you say, that German car manufacturers have been reluctant and needed to push by Tesla to develop electric vehicles. But the drawback is now they have electric vehicles, and they have electric vehicles in China, and you lose a bit of profile in the product because an electric vehicle is an electric vehicle. The engines are, you don't notice the difference between the engines, and then there is a problem with the product because the German electric cars, Volkswagens in particular, are not as well integrated into the internet as the Chinese ones. So they are suddenly confronted with a deteriorating economic environment, and on the product, the products are not as competitive as they used to be. So what are they doing? They are rapidly moving away from China, and they, of course, they are not closing factories or anything like that. But suddenly, Volkswagen rediscovers the beauty of the United States, and we don't have to. I don't have to go into the details of this ridiculous diesel scandal, but this, of course, has not been a very positive experience for US customers, and they have to rebuild their brand image. But they're doing it. I mean, they're realizing that in this environment, our long-standing romance with China is coming to an end for the reasons I described: economic policy, consumer preferences, and their own product not being up to the best in the market, and they move on. And one country, of course, is a big issue. I was in Delhi last week for an event, and this was a roadshow of so many policymakers from Europe. Before that very conference, Boris Johnson was there, and he declared that Britain will develop a free trade agreement with India by Diwali. It was typical Boris Johnson, of course. They pick a date which pleases his host. The Russian foreign minister was there, the Chinese foreign minister was there. But then in that conference, von der Leyen was there. She gave the keynote. 19 foreign ministers were there. Modi is going to be in Germany in May, and people like Tony Abbott said, the former Prime Minister of Australia, that this is our new China, quote unquote. We are going to deepen the relationship between the European Union, in Abbott's case, and Australia and India. They also have a free trade agreement as of April between Australia and India. So there is change. And as observers of globalization, this is nothing worrying. Globalization has changed its shape, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there will be less focus. This is my observation. I, of course, don't know whether that's right. My observation is there will be less emphasis on China in international economic relations. There will be more emphasis on other players. India is a significant player. It has a lot of issues, but it has certainly developed significantly. And in that day of in today's world, where we constantly observe logistics issues, where ports are closed, where I think the port of Los Angeles has a backlog of I don't know how many ships that are not being unloaded. It will be a major difference to have a significant economy where the journey time for a container from Mumbai to Bremerhaven is half the journey time than from Ningbo to Bremerhaven. So that's a difference. That will be shorter traveling times, and probably most importantly, the Indian government has changed its position on globalization, whereas they were very critical of globalization for many years. There seems to be a bit of change. It's change. It's a bit early to tell, but compared to China, which is becoming more inward-looking. India is becoming more outward-looking, and that may make a big difference.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I wonder if you could say something about Germany's view on Chinese investment in Europe. So via the Belt and Road Initiative and the Near Abroad and the accession candidate countries of the Balkans, also the Ukraine, and whether Germany has been an outlier within the EU or had much in common with other states.
Yeah, luckily I've just written something on the China, Lithuania, and the European Union, and that is, I think, a very interesting example. You have followed that Lithuania dared to open a representation not of Taipei but of Taiwan, and they were exposed to criticism criticism is mild, to some kind of sanctions by the Chinese government. And the other Europeans were sympathetic to Lithuania or with Lithuania, but they didn't do much. That has changed. The major reason is that the Chinese not only sanction products made in Lithuania, but they also sanction components made in Lithuania that are then used in finished products. And two German companies are producing in Lithuania. One is Continental, the tires manufacturer, and the other is Hella. They make headlights and stuff like that, and electrical components. And once that has happened, the German government has woken up and said, "Oh, it's not just affecting Lithuania, which only has 1% of its external trade with China, so not really much. It's also affecting us." Is that a typical pattern? I'm afraid so. The German government wakes up when German companies are directly affected, and this is maybe understandable, but this is what we have to observe. And what has changed is that the entire European Union, although we don't have an answer yet, the entire European Union is somehow trailing the US in its awareness, but the European Union is now aware that doing business with China needs a certain robustness. And one example, again, this is a very recent example, the European Union has restricted the participation of Chinese companies when it comes to public procurement. That is a relatively delicate issue, and the reason given has been that we don't exactly know what kind of subsidies the companies that participate in the tender receive, and therefore we want greater scrutiny. So the European Union as a whole is more skeptical, if not critical, of China, and Germany is no longer, as you suggested, and I would share this observation, it's no longer the outlier, it's sharing the perspective of other Europeans. Mind you, there's another large European country, Italy, which had a bit of a crisis regarding their role in the European Union, and they, at the same time, they felt that the Chinese are our new friends, and that was in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic, and there was the European Union was blamed for some of the problems that Italy had, and China was praised for having solved some of the problems. That has not lasted very long. This Italian romance between Beijing and Rome is over. So all over Europe, there is a consolidation of views along the lines that at least a skeptical, if not critical, view of Beijing is appropriate. And even I spoke to a delegation from Bosnia in Berlin not long ago, and even in those non-member countries in the Balkans, the perception has been more mature, more rational. I don't know what the right term would be. You know the example of that highway in Montenegro, which was built at great cost, and we had a bit of a discussion on the solution of that expensive highway. Montenegro couldn't pay for it, and some people in Brussels said, "Well, we have to pay for it because this is poor Montenegro," and so on and so forth. And others, including myself, said, "No, we are not bailing out Montenegro. We are bailing out the Chinese. So we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't pay the bill for a construction project that was too expensive and shouldn't have been agreed upon in the first place because they can't afford it. So if you can't afford it, don't build it. Simple as that. It sounds very Germanic, I'm afraid. And also with regard to going a bit further to the BI, Belt and Road Initiative, and African countries, I think there is a sobering moment. Of course, it was nice when there was nobody else around and nobody else was willing to invest in infrastructure and so on and so forth. But now many countries in Africa are realizing that the projects have been quite expensive, that some of them shouldn't have been constructed the way they were constructed. My favorite example is the railway line between Mombasa and Nairobi. And there was a railway line, they modernized it, it was twice as expensive as envisaged, and transport by truck is now cheaper than transport by rail. Now, what is the regulation that the Kenyan government implemented? All containers arriving in Mombasa have to be transported by train to Nairobi, including those that shall stay in Mombasa. So you have that silly regulation that takes containers from Mombasa to Nairobi and back to Mombasa. This is hardly rational, is it? So in all over the world, there continues to be a bit of a discontent with Xi Jinping's pet project, Belt and Road Initiative. I'm not saying that it's entirely useless. What I would like to suggest is that other players, including the European Union, have woken up and are developing their connectivity strategy and so on and so forth. And competition in that field seems to be a good solution.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the very important talk. When you only briefly mentioned Taiwan, and I was wondering, it's pure speculation on my part, if the sort of threats of autarky on the part of China are implicitly a bluff to say, we can withstand any sanctions you guys impose if we were to take Taiwan.
It's a good point. I mean, Taiwan would be the solution to a significant problem the People's Republic has, and that is semiconductors. I mean, I looked up the list of the world's largest semiconductor companies by turnover in 2021, and amongst the top 15, there was not a single mainland company. So TSMC, the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, would be the solution. And Xi Jinping has said that semiconductors, we have to, by 2025, I think he said that we have to produce 70% of the semiconductors produced in China. We have to produce them in China. And don't forget, I mean, China spends more money on the importation of semiconductors than on any other item, including crude oil. So they need semiconductors desperately. They can't produce them. They are years behind. And this, of course, I've thought that could be a very interesting project. At the same time, Taiwan is not Ukraine. I mean, they are heavily armed. They don't need to get instant armament. They have a lot of armament, and they already have the will to defend themselves. But whether this will be enough to deter Xi Jinping from doing what has been on his agenda for a while, I'm not sure. It's a challenge, and I have to recall the developments in the late GDR, where they had a similar problem. They also wanted to become self-sufficient in semiconductors. No joke. But the joke was that a comedian at the time observed the attempts of the GDR government to develop competitive semiconductors, and he said, that was in 1987, he said, in the GDR, we built the world's largest microchips. And so it is apparently more difficult than one thinks to build those microchips, and the GDR hasn't succeeded. It's a very interesting point. It's also difficult to read what is happening in Beijing. I recently came. I mean, nobody was questioning the authority of Xi Jinping until recently. Suddenly, there appears to be a little bit of instability in Beijing. Nobody is predicting that he will be challenged or that he will not be receiving a third term. But at least there is some discussion, right? And one observer said Chinese emperors always look mightiest just before they're down, before they're fall.
Well, in the case of the Jiangnan emperor, vis-a-vis Lord McCartney and his mission, the attitude was very clear. You don't need your stuff. Very similar to what Xi Jinping is doing.
Yeah, that's. I mean, the
decades before the Opium Wars.
I would like to ask a question about Angela Merkel. I mean, I'm not a super fan of Angela Merkel in some ways, but in 2010, Angela Merkel put a lot of pressure on the EU Trade Commissioner with respect to solar panels, arguing that we should be nice to the Chinese because we were trying to sell cars in China. So I understand your argument. But in 2018, the Germans passed significant regulations on the incoming regulation of foreign direct investment for security concerns. And so it does not seem that this is just under Chancellor Schulz that we're going to have this change. It seems Angela Merkel was already worried 4 years ago, maybe pushed by German industry, but I'd like you to talk a little more about that because it does not seem that she was a consistent cheerleader for Chinese engagement because they were already very nervous about Chinese acquisition of German companies back in 2018.
I cannot recall a single sentence of Angela Merkel herself on that issue. It was her economics minister Altmaier who said we have to do something about FDI coming from China and we have to tighten regulations. And he was the person who spoke on that issue and only he. So Merkel tolerated it, obviously, but she usually she would have spoken on the issue if she would have considered it to be useful. If she doesn't say anything, that was read as a I read it as an interpretation that she said, okay, I see that there's pressure coming from the private sector, where, for instance, the Verband der deutschen Maschinen- und Anlagenbauer, the Association of German producers of machine tools and equipment, has said we are constantly under pressure to reduce our prices because the Chinese competitors who have opaque financing structures behind them are too cheap. And there is no transparency, there is no level playing field. We have to do something about it. And for a long period of time, this phrase didn't appear, level playing field. It was not there. But now this is the phrase that both the German Minister for Economics used in 2018, 2019. These were subsequent tightenings, was not just one, I think. And and also in Brussels, the level playing field is the term that is regularly used.
But in 2018, they did pass regulations increasing the difficulty with which foreign companies, including Chinese companies, could acquire German companies. So it seems to me she may not have been the cheerleader for that, but she did not oppose it, presumably.
No, she didn't oppose it, and the defining moment was that a robotics company in Augsburg, KUKA, was sold to Midea in 2016, and that suddenly people realized, oops, we may lose core competence, and the government, as including of course the head of government, was already then altering the position in details, but not the broad picture. I don't think that it would be fair to say that the broad picture was changed. 2020, as I mentioned, she pushed this comprehensive agreement on investment against resistance from France and other European countries, and and it was her apparently exclusively within the government that pushed it. She had been under pressure even within her own Conservative Party prior to 2020. The benign approach towards China, which I tried to describe, was criticized by a range of people, including Merz, who is now successor after so many attempts. And so there was within the party there was criticism that she ignored. She basically ignored it, and we would of course now like to hear her comments on Ukraine, but we don't hear anything from her at the moment.
Give me the questions or not? So maybe I can ask a question about that famous, well-known person, Chancellor Schröder, who some people say on the Ukraine issue is not exactly a hero in Germany anymore. Could you talk a little bit about him?
Yeah, he's Schröder has been a close friend of Vladimir Putin. I see Putin all the time. And
my conference, by the way.
Okay. And today there is, as I said, German society is highly emotional, and there are many calls to sack Schröder from the Social Democratic Party, or you dismiss him, you don't sack him. You expel him. If you expel him from the Social Democratic Party, they have already taken several titles away from him, like honorary citizen of Hanover and so on and so forth. And Schröder hardly says anything. He's a rather robust character, although I'm sure it affects him. For me, it is a bit of a surprise that suddenly everybody knows how bad it was to have those close relations with Russia and with Putin. If so many people knew it before the 24th February 2022, why didn't they say it? This is what Schröder said, by the way. And again, the question is, why did several governments not take notice of what is happening? We had 2014, we had the annexation of Crimea, and Phil Stevens wrote in the Financial Times, the world is, and I quote, the world is waking up from its postmodern dreams of global governance. And he wrote a few other things, which then were quite striking, but they're even more striking from today's perspective, because you ask yourself, well, if a journalist from the FT can come up with that perception, why didn't we develop what we could have developed earlier, a certain distance from Russia? Although I'm no fan of this current vigor with which Russia shall disappear from the map. Ivan Krastev wrote in the Financial Times a piece, I think the week before last, where he said that the Europeans want to Chernobylize Russia. They want to pour concrete on it and want to make it disappear. And I don't think that is a good idea, despite all the difficulties, despite the violation of international norms and standards. This country will not disappear. We will have to find a solution. We will have to talk to Putin and to negotiate something. But again, in coming back to Schröder and coming back to the very emotional atmosphere in Germany at the moment, this is a very distant prospect to come to some solution. So at the moment, I think the risk is for more conflict, for potentially sleepwalking into deep conflict, and I find that really worrying. And there are a few voices that are critical of what is happening at the moment. Habermas last week defended Chancellor Scholz, who is cautious, suggests that we shall not slide into a nuclear confrontation with Russia, which I think is a rather appropriate perception. So, but Schröder is under fire, and I don't think it is a good development. It's opportunism in a very blunt form, and it's the opposite of strategic thinking. What I said at the beginning, we are not very good in developing strategies. We live in Heine's dreamland. We have very high moral values, and we are shell-shocked as a German society that other countries have other norms and maybe have no moral value. But I think if you live outside that OECD world, this is nothing new to you. And again, I come back to that conference last week in India. If you speak to people, to Indian academics and policymakers, they are of course totally surprised that the Europeans seem to have thought that there is no war anymore on the planet. If you live in India and if you live in other parts of the non-OECD world, I think this is no news that there is war out there, and that there is armament out there, that there is conflict out there. So I think with a bit of an optimistic perspective, maybe we are learning from that, and maybe we are learning to develop strategies. And maybe one irony is that some 4 years ago, a certain American president wanted to encourage the Germans to buy American liquefied natural gas. And that very American president, I don't name him, he sold that proposal as freedom gas. and of course, everybody laughed about that at the time. Today, Economics Minister Habeck is doing exactly what Trump said 4 years ago, and he's doing it at twice the price, because at the moment it's of course difficult to build anything. So these are sometimes entertaining developments, but sometimes they're just sobering.
Well,
The dynamic is slowing down. The war has started in Ukraine. You see these two fights.
Well, the link I see is that unfortunately we are in less a cheerful mood than we could have been, because leaving that pandemic behind it with all the negative developments it has had would have been nice, but of course we can't, because there is now the war. Now, what you're implying is there a connection, some kind of connection between the two, or
I'm talking about Chinese and Russian relationship, and that's the point. Is there a common strategy? That's my question.
I am not able to detect one, but maybe I haven't spent enough time thinking about that. What I find irritating, and this is from a plain, old-fashioned, realist perspective, is that we are currently doing what Brzezinski in the 1980s said we should avoid at any cost. We, as the West, we should avoid that Russia and China team up. Now we get exactly that, but whether there is a link with the pandemic, I don't know. But I feel, I mean, we have all suffered and continue to be affected by the pandemic, and in particular the young have been affected by the pandemic. Not us living in a rather stable life, if I may call it like that. And I feel that they were just crawling out of this deep crisis at universities, coming back to seminars in presence, and now the next crisis hits them. That is for them. I feel it's not very nice. But I can't see a direct connection at this juncture. But maybe there is one. I'm not sure.
Well, our time is up, and you've been very entertaining, Heribert, and also very informative. And I thank you and the Institute of European Studies for sponsoring your visit. And we're very pleased you were able to come, and hope you'll come back again. So thank you very much, and the meeting is adjourned.